we're really pleased to be discussing the new Agora Symposium in the American Journal of International Law, published in the October 2020 issue, volume 114, issue 4. The Agora is on the international legal order and the global pandemic. After the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Larry and I thought that it would be useful to have scholars reflect fairly quickly on some of the implications for the pandemic on international law and institutions. It was obvious, even from the very beginning of the pandemic, that it was having significant effects on international travel, migration, the international economy, international trade, and that it could potentially lead to various restrictions on human rights. And it was also raising issues of state responsibility, just to name some of the issues that were already beginning to appear early on. And so it also occurred to us that in addition to its many devastating effects, which are continuing as we do this video, that there might be opportunities arising out of responses to the pandemic or the issues that it highlights to make positive changes in the international legal order. And we thought it would be useful to start thinking about those positive possibilities as well early on. So we decided that it would make sense for the American Journal to sponsor a symposium on the international legal order and the global pandemic. We put out a worldwide call for papers at the beginning of April 2020, and we had a pretty short deadline of July 1st for the submissions. And we also limited the length to no more than 5,000 words so that people could actually craft the essays of that length and that time period. We had no idea what to expect. When you put out a worldwide call for papers, you don't know exactly how it will turn out. And we were very pleased with the results. I would even say the results were phenomenal. We had over 150 papers submitted in response to the call. These were from over 40 different countries, authors in 40 different countries. So that presented a lot of manuscripts for us to review. And we ultimately, after reading them all and discussing them all, ended up selecting 13 of these submissions for publication in the print volume of the journal. I think that may be the highest number of Agora essays ever published in a single print volume of the American Journal. And we decided to select that many essays in part because we were so impressed with the overall quality of the submissions that we had received. And we were also struck by the broad range of topics and methodologies represented in the submissions. And we wanted to reflect some of that diversity of content in the actual Agora that we end up publishing. So that's a little bit about the beginning of that process and the submissions we received. Larry can tell you a little bit about the actual content of the Agora.
Right, so as Kurt said, we were really quite capacious in thinking about what sort of perspectives we wanted. We did not want to limit the contributors at all, and they could have addressed issues from a historical, institutional perspective, doctrinal, critical, or any mix of perspectives, because obviously when you have such a fast-moving set of events, we want to allow people to have a little bit of freedom to think through from their particular perspectives how the global pandemic might affect the international legal order. And we were very pleased by the diversity of topics, as Kurt said. So obviously the role of international organizations, in particular the World Health Organization, is extremely relevant here. That organization has experienced quite a few challenges. This is not the first pandemic that the WHO has addressed, but it has perhaps been among the most challenging. And so not surprisingly, we have two essays in the volume that address the WHO and the nature of the cooperation it can fairly be said to elicit from its member states. We also wanted to think through the ways in which emergencies in general affect how international regulation and domestic regulation relating to foreign affairs operate. So the idea of the emergency or exceptional situation shows up in the context of how executive branch officials act, and we have an essay on that. And it also shows up in the resort to a kind of exceptionalism set of norms. And that's true both in the trade context and in the investment context and international economic law, but also more generally in the context of how we conceptualize when it's permitted under international law for governments to limit particular treaty-based or customary-based rights and freedoms of individuals, of groups, of corporations, and so forth. So that we thought was another really important theme that cut across a number of the submissions. In the area of human rights in particular, that was obviously a huge concern. A number of governments have responded to the pandemic with restrictions that some would say are necessary and appropriate, such as those on limiting freedom of movement, freedom to travel for limited periods of time. On the other hand, other governments have quite substantially restricted rights and freedoms and arguably used the pandemic as an excuse to repress political opponents, minority groups, disadvantaged groups in society. And so we have a number of essays with respect to those sets of issues. Finally, in terms of the response of the international community, as Kurt mentioned, the paradigmatic approach of state responsibility is very much in play. The question of who's responsible for the pandemic and how one conceptualizes what might most appropriately be thought of as a shared responsibility. Those are very new issues. They're issues that the International Law Commission has considered in some contexts, but not perhaps as fully as the current circumstances suggest. So we have a number of contributions on the question of state responsibility and the mechanisms for responsibility, as well as how it might be allocated across different governments. And finally, the question of the end of the pandemic. We were very pleased to get articles that are both about the beginning of an exceptional period, but also how pandemics or similar emergencies actually are terminated, and the extent to which the scientific or political or cultural diminution of these exceptional times might not map onto the way in which the law addresses the end of pandemics. So we think that these 13 essays, which we summarize in our introduction, we hope they will be stimulating for readers and will continue a broad conversation over time. And with that regard, I think the last thing I'll say is we're very pleased that the entire Agora, all of the 13 essays in the introduction, will be open access till the end of calendar year 2020, which we again hope will encourage lots of interaction with the essays that are there.
And just to add to the open access of the Agora, the online component of the American journal, AJIL Unbound, also has another symposium related to the COVID pandemic coming out in November, specifically focused on the impact of the pandemic on migration, issues relating to migration and the international law relating to the movement of peoples, and a very rich set of essays. And as always, the Unbound essays are freely open access as well. As a kind of challenge to us in thinking about the Agora, I will make note of one other issue, which is, we realize it's a challenge to try to think about as a scholar or practitioner reflecting on the international legal order to think about how this will develop while you're in the midst of an emergency or a crisis. And as we publish this Agora, as we record this video, the pandemic is still raging around the world and having devastating effects. And it's a challenge to try to write within that and to think about both the implications of what you're experiencing and where the law or institutions might be headed, both now and in the future. It's always difficult to forecast anyway, but it's particularly a challenge when, of course, our own thoughts about what's happening are affected by the events that are around us. So we were very conscious of that. Having said that, we also think people writing during a crisis and emergency have a unique vantage point to be reporting on the effects that they can observe and experience, and that some of that would be lost if one only wrote about something with the benefit of hindsight. And we also thought there were opportunities here for creative and innovative thinking about ways both to address the immediate problems before us, but also how to potentially reform law or institutions, and that we should not waste time trying to think in those innovative ways about it. And we were quite pleased with the creative thinking and deep reflections that appear in the Agora essays. And we hope that you find that they're useful in generating ideas, both for now and in the future.